have to watch a clock. I don't even have to watch a clock. I don't even have to watch a clock. I don't even have to watch a clock.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for listening to the Bold Moves podcast. I hope you're staying healthy and safe. I was torn on whether to keep going with this or to give it a little bit of a rest right now during this quarantine time. And you may be able to hear that I fostered a puppy. Those were his little paws on the floor. But I decided that when you're at home, you might need some inspiration and you might have even more time to listen to some podcasts. And I don't want to leave you hanging. So here we are. Today I am sharing my interview with Jeff Large, who used to be a teacher and decided to instead become an entrepreneur. Of course, he shares his story so much better than I do, so I'm going to let him tell it instead of me. Keep on listening for Jeff Large's story. Hello, everyone. Today I am chatting with Jeff Large. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hi, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So obviously you know that the show is called Bold Moves, and you wouldn't be sitting here chatting with me if you hadn't made some. So I would love if you shared with my audience and I some of the bold moves you've made, your story, and what got you to here.
Yeah, obviously that's huge. So I'll just summarize and then I'll allow you to sort of guide the way of what you want to get into. I would say there's two big ones that stand out, and these were the two that I mentioned to you when we talked kind of before the interview when we were exchanging some emails.
Sure.
The first one was I was a teacher, for a formally trained educator, taught for roughly 7 years, and partway around that kind of 7-year-ish mark, we had some pretty major transitions in my administration team, and was not a huge fan of where the company, or with the school rather, was going. Very student oriented and that kind of a thing, but the new admin team, it was focused on standardized testing and some different things.
Sure.
It just did not feel like it put their best interests in mind. And so I was working on the side just a little bit, and ended up making a pretty significant jump from being full-time salary employed and having a family dependent on me and my wife who stayed at home at the time, and all those things, and turned in my letter of resignation and just started my own business from there. At that moment, we had one client who was I think they were paying me like $15 an hour or something, like one web development client. And so like some people are like, my side hustle outpaced my income. And I'm like, no,
nope.
that was not the case. And so
even
that was
with
one.
a teacher's income, which is not known for being
yeah. No, it's not like that was
to beat.
exactly. So that was one thing. And then the second was I've been running my company now, Come Alive Creative, for I got to be coming up on 7 years here. I don't remember exactly. I think 6 or 7-ish years, somewhere in that bracket. And we started off as web development, played around in kind of different facets of it, different niches of it for a little while. But I'd say it's about 3-ish or 4-ish years ago now. I don't remember the exact date. Ended up, we were doing pretty well, but I just got sick of web development. We were doing a little bit of podcast production on the side. And we ended up gutting all of our services, offboarding a bunch of our clients, and completely pivoting to exclusively only offering podcast production. And we've been doing that since. And so I'd say those are two of the bigger ones that definitely come to mind in terms of kind of risky transitions.
Absolutely. Well, your first one is very, very similar to my own in a lot of ways. I taught for 6 years. And then for me, I was teaching in Wisconsin. And I don't know if you remember, about 15 years ago in Wisconsin, our former governor, Scott Walker, was causing a lot of ruckus, and it was national news, but there were people protesting in the Capitol. He wanted to do a lot of crazy things, but one of them was eliminate any teacher education requirements so that anyone with any college degree could be a teacher in Wisconsin, which made me nervous for my job security because I had my, of course, education degree, plus had completed some of my coursework for my master's. And then that put me at a higher pay bracket. And I'm like, well, of course they could pay somebody else thousands of dollars less that had less experience. And I was stressed out all the time anyway. So my mom was like, well, maybe this is actually good for you. If you lost your job, you could, do more of what you love with modeling and makeup artistry, which was my side hustle, which was also not outpaying my huge teacher salary. So
Yeah.
I did kind of the same thing where it was just like, okay, this is my last year.
Yeah. Yeah. And then remind me, what did you teach again?
I taught middle school and high school, and it was a
Okay.
wide variety of classes because it was a language immersion school.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was like math and social studies in French, US history in French, and
Yep.
yeah, English and all kinds of things. It was different every year.
Yeah.
So I had generally had 5 preps that were changing every year,
Yeah. Very good.
which probably led to my burnout too. One thing that I'm curious about that I feel like it, I guess with your switch, you went to something that still people require a decent amount of education for, but I always am interested in the like identity crisis that goes along with something that you
Oh,
got your degree in and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm doing this, or if it's hard to explain what your actual job is, like when you first made that switch. How did that go for you with just like kind of up and switching?
yeah. Yeah. There's a couple different ways I guess I can tackle that. So it'd be a little more relatable for other people that are considering it or have gone through it. And on one hand, I think the most important thing, and also I'll lead with this, is that it didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't struggle a whole lot with that. I have a couple even friends like in the space that I'm working in now, and they'll do kind of talks geared around like imposter syndrome is a
Mm-hmm.
term that's thrown around a lot of like you kind of feel like a fraud or a fake when
Sure.
really you're not. There's no reason for you to feel that way, but you do. And fortunately, I didn't worry about it a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
I've Part of it I think is because I've always been a jack of all trades to a large extent, and I
Mm-hmm.
dabbled in a lot of different things, and it was just I had a big technology background. I did a lot with audio in general. I was a musician, and so like producing albums and things like that. A
Mm-hmm.
fair amount of background in like video and editing in that way. I was responsible for the bands I was in to do a lot of the promotional type things, and so if you look back at pretty much any journey, I feel like there's a lot of just milestones that bring us to where we are now. And
Mm-hmm.
so all of that was present for me. And so it was something that knowing like knowing that we had a client already, that I was familiar enough with the space, that I had a web development background. I had at the time when I quit, it was me and then 2 graphic designers. And so I was
Mm-hmm.
doing most of the dev work and then the designers were obviously doing the designing. And I was working with that one person and I just figured we can do this. And the
Mm-hmm.
worst case scenario, like the going into, I remember pretty distinctly that weekend. It was roughly like for anybody that doesn't teach, you usually have some sort of like mandatory meetings, usually a couple weeks before the school year starts, of just kind
Right.
of getting everybody back in the groove, going over procedures, talking about the year. And we were roughly probably 3 weeks out from ours. And so it's like about a month and a half before school starts and maybe three
Mm-hmm.
weeks before our like kind of staff meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had this really huge feeling of dread. And oddly enough, my wife did too, like at the same time. And so when we talked about it, we're like, okay. And we kind of hashed it out over the weekend where we also knew like what's worst case scenario. And
Right.
worst case scenario is that we burn through our savings, which we had about 6 months worth of savings at that point, and
Mm-hmm.
I go back to teaching. And we're like, okay, that doesn't sound too bad. Like,
Right.
let's go for it. So, like, in a lot of ways, that transition wasn't too difficult. On the other hand, I mean, I had pushback from my friends. I was a pretty good educator. I had a good track record. I
Mm-hmm.
loved my students. That's like the hardest part, and I would guess you can relate to. Like that's the
Mm-hmm.
worst thing was leaving the students.
Right.
And I worked in it wasn't inner city, but it was urban, and
Mm-hmm.
we did a lot of good. Like we did a lot of good while we were there, and some of the other staff members that were with me. Um, but it was a necessary move. I'm really, really glad that I did it. But at moments, it was hard simply because I knew those things were true.
Mm-hmm.
And some of my friends that knew me pretty well, they're like, why the heck are you leaving? And it was like, not intentional guilt, but kind of
Right.
like, those kids need you. Like,
Yeah.
this is going on. This is who you are. Like, this is how you were trained. Like, some of those things you were talking about. And so I probably could have fell into that if I would have listened more
Mm-hmm.
to their thoughts. But I think, I mean, for what it's worth, you got to trust your gut at times.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, like while those things were true, it's not that those things weren't true. I'm sure I could have stayed and I'm sure I still could have made a good impact, but I felt like it was time. I had the confirmation of the same feelings from my wife. I'm a person of faith, and so I had some confirmation there just within my own faith life, and a lot of things led me to go for it, and I did. And I mean, I don't know, what are you going to do at that point? You don't really have a choice besides just do it.
Right.
So I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does, and it provides a lot of insight too that I wasn't even asking for. So it was a nice bonus. But I'm glad that you brought up your wife again, because that's one way that our story differs a lot, and that I think makes your bold move even bolder. Because for me, I was like 29 years old and had a boyfriend, but nobody was depending on me. So, I mean, I guess I didn't have his income to help me or anything in rough times. But you said your
Hmm.
wife was at home at the
Hmm.
same time, and you have a child or children.
Yeah, we had kids. My son at the time was probably 6, and then we had our daughter was like just born. Like she had to have been no, like, okay, that doesn't make sense math wise. This is what happens when you do math live. My
I was
daughter,
going to
my
say, you could have played that off. We don't know your story.
I know, and I have to stay true to it. My daughter was no older than 2, which means my son would have been no older than 9. And then,
Okay.
like I said, my wife was a stay-at-home wife. She wasn't working at the time just because she was with both the kids.
Hmm.
Like our son was in school then; he was going to public at that point. But I mean, just full time with our daughter. And that kind of a thing. And so yeah, like when you have other human beings like completely depending on you to succeed, it's a necessary and very difficult weight to carry at points.
I'm sure, especially given like there's no insurance, right? So you
Yeah,
have
once you
all of a
once you
sudden,
leave, like you all of a sudden you don't have a 401k, you don't have insurance, you like all these things you just kind of take for granted are your responsibility. Like
yeah,
it's nuts in that sense. It's funny. I haven't thought about any of this in a long time, so it's kind of fun to have the conversation. But yeah, like
right,
those initial like what the heck do you do for insurance? Like, I mean, just
right.
that is usually taken care of in some capacity. Like, you're on your parents still, or your job
Right.
offers it, and you just go, okay, and check the box.
Here's my
But
one option or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah, it's that's definitely a wild one.
So I would love to hear, logistically speaking, how you made that transition, because if it's something that you're doing as a side hustle with one client, that's obviously not even, 40 hours a week or 40 plus hours a week at $15 an hour. So in the beginning, how did you make that work?
Yeah, I don't remember
You're
completely. I mean,
like,
like
I backed out and suddenly everything's okay.
no, I mean, the reality of it, like in the very beginning, I'm trying to think of those initial steps. You just do what you think you need to do, and I mean,
Right.
fortunately, I'm a learner, and so I was consuming a ton of different stuff. I think at the time, like I cared about resources. This was like early days Pat Flynn, like early
Okay.
days smart passive income I was consuming, and then like some of the other kind of sort of entities around him, like maybe early days, like social media marketer. And so there's all the facets where like now I can name them. Like as
Right.
a business owner now, I know I needed to worry about things like sales,
Hmm.
operations, marketing, admin is really what it comes down to if you're going to kind of boil it down into 4 simple components. And so then it's like I knew enough to develop. I knew how to talk to people. I figured I could learn how to sell. I figured I could learn how to actually market outside of a website or things like that. And then it was
Hmm.
just really like I don't remember the exact order, but it's just you would encounter a problem and then have to figure out a solution for it. And so I think like the initial things were like, okay, how do you get your name out there? And I'd start writing blog posts. I was active on social. Um, uh, Making sure that you understood how to talk to clients. Like you'd run into issues like, okay, how do I structure a contract? And then so I do a bunch of research on where do I get my contracts from or how do I write them? And like
Hmm.
eventually you end up hiring, at least I did. A lot of people will end up hiring professionals in those realms, so you don't have to
Hmm.
worry about it anymore. But in the beginning, for most bootstrapped people, I won't speak for any like venture capitalist type stuff, but for most
Right.
bootstrap people, you're doing everything unless
Hmm.
you have the funds to hire somebody else to help you. And so I don't have the exact attack plan, but it's just you'd encounter a lot of those beginning problems and then figure out how to solve it.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm curious what through all of this, and maybe it's even something that you haven't brought up yet, but I always like to ask people what the scariest moment is or the scariest thing that they've been through. So since you kind of, have made a few different big jumps, I'm wondering if any of those are your scariest moment or if there's something else that you'd like to share that, you kind of had a like, all right, this is a big deal
Yeah,
mentality.
yeah. Scary. Fortunately I don't get scared a whole lot.
Okay.
Maybe I would probably classify mine more as like the anxiety or the stress that it can bring.
Okay.
Fear's a smaller factor, but I think for me personally, it has a lot more to do with like the anxiety or the weight of it. And we did have two different times that the company basically ran out of money. There was one in the beginning, it was one early on, and it was like we were still figuring out everything. I think it was within 2 years or so, and it like got to the point that there was a single it's such a surreal experience because I was doing everything that I knew to do at the time. And so it wasn't
Hmm.
like we were being lazy or anything. And our company
Right.
at that point, I think like I had a couple people working with me. It might have been a team of 5 or something. And so we had clients. It just wasn't enough. Like it just wasn't
Hmm.
enough to do our normal cost of living and some of those things. And so we got to a spot where we legit just like all of our money was gone.
Yeah.
And then I go back, it's so funny, like like look at me compared to I bring my wife up again, where she was like kind of excited because it was this opportunity. It sounds stupid, but it's like this opportunity of faith and this opportunity to see like, okay, like what is God going to do in this situation? And then for me, I'm like, this is a nightmare. Like,
Well, it sounds like you have great balance, and I feel like that is such a great mindset for an
yeah.
entrepreneur or a wife of an entrepreneur that like you can't teach that, and that's amazing.
Oh gosh, yeah. That we're it, like it's it. I love her dearly. That this is a tangent, but it's like we're usually exactly what the other person needs most of the time. So when she's stressed, I'm not. When I'm stressed, she's not. And it's like that's kind of 75% of how we operate. Like we'll get at each other at times still, but for the most
Sure.
part, we're very supportive to each other. And so like it was just funny to look back at it where I distinctly remember her being very trusting, and it's not that I wasn't, but I'm like, I'm failing as a father and a
Yeah.
husband, and this is terrible. And it got to the spot that we had, I think our church ended up having to pay 1 month of our mortgage. And in the meantime, at that point, I've like started going back and applying to teaching positions. And it was when I felt like I truly just let go. And I was like, okay, I got to make something work at this point. Like I
Hmm.
can't sit and dink around or try to keep going with the business. Like I'm just going to do these things. And there was a couple positions even that for me on paper, like I would have been a shoo-in for. It was my exact credentials. If anything, I
Yeah.
improved at it over the time of running the business. And then it was literally within the next month, we had like a wave of clients come in. And it was pretty much from then on out, we were pretty set. We had one other time frame where it was just kind of transitionally with
Hmm.
payment schedules and things where it got a little low, but that wasn't nearly as much. I would say it was that time was really tough because there was about a month where I'm like, we're out of options and I need to go back to work. And then to see like to kind of have that experience of when I truly interiorly let go and was
Hmm.
like, okay, let's just whatever I need to do to make this work, let's make it work. And all of a sudden the business is like, all right, like starts picking up again like that. That was pretty crazy.
I love that. So I usually follow that question up with like, how do you push past fear? But it sounds like you kind of answered that already with, having your wife to balance you and your faith to keep you going,
Yeah.
going to the backup plan as a potential that you ended up not needing to do, and just kind of looking at whatever options you need to kind of balance or, keep you afloat. Do you have anything that you would add to that as advice for pushing past fear or a tough situation?
Yeah, I think you don't want to minimalize it. And so even though like I don't feel like I've been affected by it as much, there's definitely people in my life that I've seen its effects. And so I don't want
Hmm.
to I hopefully I'm not sounding like I'm minimalizing it by any means. I think having a good community is huge. Like there's
Hmm.
really no it's hard to put any sort of price tag or like value of a good community where not only do I have the unfair advantage of my wife, but our community in general
Hmm.
is amazing. Like, we live in a really great area. We have a really good friend group that we've all kind of supported each other. Some of us having just regular full-time jobs. I'd say about half of us are like self-employed in some capacity. And so we
Hmm.
can know what it feels like, and we're able to support each other in that sense. Um, as I've grown the business and been able to meet people and network through that, like, you start to build out this sort of secondary or almost like a halo type community. So I'd say
Okay.
that is a really, really big component. Like, when you have questions, like, I mean, a lot of it seems like fear is when you just, it's the unknown. It's
Hmm.
kind of being scared of the unknown. And it's like, when you have a community or when you have resources, there's a means to just solve that. Like, instead
Hmm.
of sitting there and being like, oh no, what will happen, go find somebody that knows what will happen, like, and talk to them. And so I think that's huge. And then, like, again, not everybody's a faith-based person, and so I wouldn't push that on anybody in that sense. But one thing that's come up for me more recently, and even some of the thoughts that I've been having with some of the things we've been working on in present day,
Hmm.
just I believe it's a Saint Augustine quote where it's like, pray as if God was in charge of everything, and then work as if you were. And
I like that.
I really can't underestimate, like, if something needs to get done, get it done.
Hmm.
I have a bad tendency of wanting to learn, and learning can also be a crutch. Like, it can slow you down from doing
Sure.
what you need to do, and you spend all the time processing the information. Sometimes you just need to put your nose to the grindstone and make it happen. Like, get,
Hmm.
if you need more sales, like, do what is necessary to get more sales. If you have to crank out a massive project, do what is necessary to get that massive project done. And so, just so sort of that pushing through even when it's tough.
Hmm.
I don't know, like, sometimes you have to do the opposite, like, burn the bridges in order to give yourself no other options outside of moving forward.
That's fantastic. I'm curious also, since you've kind of brought, you've had so many different avenues, whether it's education, the web development, podcast production, or if it's something related to your faith. But I'm wondering if you know your purpose in life, and if so, or your interpretation of it, because that's different for so many people. And if so, if you wouldn't mind sharing it, because it seems like, as a fellow jack of all trades, that could be something where it's like they're just doing all sorts of things.
Yeah, yeah. I think two things come up for me personally. Um, Personally, one of my biggest thoughts is to just be the person that I was intended to be. And I know a huge component of that is to love well in the process. And so
Ooh.
I hope the interactions that I have, whether it's personal or business or a stranger or like you and I talking now, I'm
Hmm.
hoping that the other person walks away like a little more happy, a little more joyful, like those kinds of things. Like, that's important
Sure.
to me, to actually be present to the people that I'm talking to.
Hmm.
And then I think from a professional angle, this is, I know you mentioned that you're going to ask me about books. Here's one that naturally comes up. Are you familiar with the Entrepreneurs Organization System?
No, I'm
Um,
intrigued though.
yeah, EOS is similar. It's basically, without going into super detail, it's just a business framework that you can
Okay.
build your business around. The guy that wrote that one out is Gino Wickman, is the primary catalyst behind that. And so there is the book is Traction, and that's the fiction is nonfiction's not fake. So it's a non like, I gotta remind myself, fiction, nonfiction. It's the nonfiction explanation of how to do EOS. And then
Okay.
there's another book called Get a Grip, that is a fictional story of a company implementing EOS. And so I
Okay.
went through those two things, and they have one component is this thing called a vision traction organizer. And
Okay.
one of the things that you have to do is boil down what your purpose is. And so, through working with a couple people on my team, for us, it's our company, but at the same time, it's because it's what I've been told for years now with the people that I've worked with. It's taking complex ideas and making them understandable, and
Hmm.
then applying the right solutions based on what we learn. And
Okay.
so, within, say, just as an example, like the podcast space, it can get kind of complicated when you start looking at how do you structure a show, what equipment do you need, how do you do all these different pieces. I've spent the time, and my team has spent the time, to be able to really dig into all those things in depth, and then
Hmm.
hopefully, like, where I can start to pull from my teaching your roots is just presented in a way that it's really easy to understand. Like, it doesn't have to be as complex as it is. And there's usually a lot of different variables and there's usually a lot of different options, but I want to work with you and help you understand, like, this is what we're dealing with, this is where we're going, and this is how we're
Mhm.
going to get there. And so it's like trying to just make things easier, like trying to make things better.
Okay, I love that. I think that that's really great that you're able to find a way to kind of have an umbrella purpose that goes over, everything that you're doing. And I think that's what
Hmm.
generally makes the most sense in what I call everythingers, who are people like us that just do a ton of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And I love the idea too of just loving well. That's one thing that I've never heard worded that way. I've heard a lot of people say a similar kind of explanation where it's like, I want to make every person I encounter a little happier or make their day a little brighter. And I think the idea of loving well is really fantastic, because I think a lot of times love is not seen as a verb so much as a noun. So I really
Hmm.
like that twist. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
And since you brought up books and you, of course, are recommending Traction and Get a Grip, I assume, I'd love to
Hmm.
ask any other required reading lists go back into your teacher role. But it can be fiction, nonfiction. But if anyone's liking what you're saying and thinks they would like to read some of the same things as you, any book recommendations now would be awesome.
You got to give me some direction, because there's like a million different books I would answer depending on the topic. So, like, how about you? What are you interested in right now? What do you want to learn more about?
Well, I generally read a lot of just personal development and, overall. So I don't really have a specific genre. I have been actually like lately at night kind of thing, and I really wish I had like a non or a fiction book to get into. So if you have that too, I'm open, but I
Okay.
don't know that there's like a narrowed down topic that would be
Okay.
ideal.
Okay. Fair enough.
I mean, I've
I'll
I've started reading Beyond the Pill by Dr. Jolene Brighton, but I'm guessing
Okay.
that birth control is probably not one of your areas of expertise. And
you
like the women's bodies
I
and how they
you
interact.
you would be surprised.
Oh
It's
yeah?
my wife and I, we practice natural family planning and some other
Okay.
stuff. So yeah, that is a completely not business tangent, but you'd be surprised.
Well,
There's
feel free to drop any book recommendations in that area around, because like a year and a half ago, I think I had a guest on who told me about all of the horrible things the birth control pill does to women's bodies.
It's nuts. Yes.
And I was like, oh my gosh. And I think that was the last month I took birth control. And then I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, now I need to learn more about
Holy
what I
moly. Yeah,
need.
that's a hot topic. I don't normally bring that up in public, because people have very strong opinions around it. So I'm gonna table that for maybe after after the
All right,
podcast.
fair enough.
But in terms of like going back to some of the business or fiction, just a good read. One of my all-time, probably two. I'm gonna give just a handful, and
Yeah,
I'll let people
perfect.
pick. The first book that ever got me into reading, I didn't really start becoming an avid reader until my
Mhm.
freshman year. Like, I remember my parents reading to me when I was a kid, but it was my freshman year in high school, and it was Fahrenheit 451.
Okay.
Guy Montag is the protagonist in that book, and he's like one of my favorite protagonists ever, and I just love the whole book in general.
Okay.
Another one that's more of a classic is Of Mice and Men.
Hmm.
I believe Steinbeck was that one. That's another just really great kind of read for fun. Tough, but at the same time, just great, really great book.
Okay.
And then in terms of like business stuff, some that allow me to spin around real quick. Things that I liked. Oh, that's one. Okay. If you want to learn about, I'm looking at my bookshelf right now in case they're not looking at the video, if somebody's just listening to this. Um, Out on a Wire by Jessica Abel is an excellent graphic novel of basically public radio and how public radio is made. And so I cared about it from the podcasting angle, but it is absolutely fascinating. And so it's just kind of comic book style,
Okay.
how like This American Life and Snap Judgment and all these other shows get made.
Okay. Cool.
I really liked, shoot, what is it called? The company is missing link. You got to forgive me. I have to look because it's worth mentioning. One moment.
We might have to have you edit this out, Sienna.
I just grabbed two.
Okay.
One is Legicide. I bring this one up because it's a friend of mine. He's a South African entrepreneur. So
Okay.
this book, most people in the States probably haven't heard about it. But its kind of tagline is why legacy thinking is a silent killer of innovation. And this offered some really fresh perspectives. Plus, it's super short. Like it's like 123 pages because he sort
Okay.
of bucked the system in terms of the book has to be 287 pages or whatever, like most business books are. And so he gets right into it. And then this was probably my favorite book of last year. So of 2019, it's called Smart Cuts by Shane Snow.
Okay.
And this was another thing of the tagline on this one is breakthrough power of lateral thinking. And its general premise, and something that I'm a pretty big believer in, of we can learn a ton of information from looking cross industry. And so he's pulling from things like techno music and surfing and like these different concepts and then applying it back to how certain startups and businesses have been incredibly successful. And it's very like principle driven. And that one was really good for me too. I'd say the last one, just to throw a bonus one in there, I've avoided reading it for a long time, but Delivering Happiness, which is like the Zappos story from the former CEO of Zappos. It was like a super popular book at the time. I forget what the initial copyright is on it, but it is not at all what I expected. I'm probably like 60 pages in right now, and it's just a like super even from a business book standpoint, like right now it's just been all story. Like it's his story of kind of going through his college years and then having his first company and selling it. And then now like I'm at the point where he's just starting to back Zappos with the company that will become Zappos. And I mean, he's just a super funny writer. Like I've actually been engaged where I'm not usually that way with the story driven business style books. So there you go. There's a whole bunch of homework for your listener.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that. And I loved the variety. So that's really cool. I always like to ask people where they can be found. So of course, if somebody is listening that is looking for podcast production or the services that you offer, your company website or any social media, but then since you have so many great book recommendations, if you have any personal social media or something that you'd like to share in case someone wants to reach out, I'd love to hear where that would be too.
Yeah, I'm going to end up giving too many. If you want to know from the company standpoint, comealivecreative.com. And so if you're interested in podcast production, that would be the place to go. We have a fair amount of resources and all our services are there. And then my personal site is just Jeff Large, LARGE.com. And I have links out to all our social, or my social rather. Twitter is the best place if somebody wants to get a hold of me. I'll talk on LinkedIn, but LinkedIn I'm way more hesitant about because people always try to sell me stuff there. But Twitter, if you're on Twitter, I'm there often, and that's probably the place that I respond the fastest. So just search. You can just search my name, and I'll show up. It's pretty simple.
Okay, cool. And I'll make sure that all of that and your book recommendations are in the show notes so that people can access them that way too. But I like to ask in case people are running or driving and
absolutely
look it up easily. Do you have any other advice, like lessons you've learned, any sort of value that you feel on your heart to share, or, a message that you wanted to put out there but hasn't come up in conversation at all? I like to give people opportunity in case there's something they need to get off their chest.
Yeah, not so much. I would say the only thing, if you're listening, I assume the type of people who often listen to these kind of shows is because they're either just starting or they want to dabble. And so it's nice to hear from other people who have. I just say go for it. I mean, what's the worst case scenario? You be realistic, but at the same time, like, I mean, if it's a reasonable risk and you want to try something, I mean, either you do or you don't. So, give it a whirl, see what happens. Worst case scenario, go back to what you were doing. But I mean, don't doubt it. Just go for it if it's something you're interested in.
I think that's fantastic advice. Thank you very much for sharing that. And then my last question is one of my favorites to ask. And it is that if 8-year-old Jeff had a crystal ball and you could see, the teaching, that career arc, the web development career arc, of course, your family, alongside you through all of it, and then now what you're doing, and then maybe you know what you're doing the next couple months, or have a big trip coming up you're looking forward to, or whatever the foreseeable future is. On a scale of 1 to 11, how excited would little Jeff be to see what big Jeff's doing?
Oh man, that is an interesting question.
Thank you. It's a fun one. I like it.
I don't think I would. I don't know if that's the answer that you normally get, but if 8-year-old Jeff to look at, I'm trying to put myself, like, my daughter's 7. And so if I told my daughter her life trajectory at this point, she'd be like, okay, and then just kind of go about her business. So I would say I probably wouldn't be super excited, but for me to like reflect on everything now, I would say 11. Like, it's definitely been a blast. And yeah, I have very, very few regrets. I have a couple, but most of them are minor enough that it's not a big deal. So
Okay.
life's good. Life's good. Can't complain.
I love that answer, because I feel like it's easy to look at where you are and be happy with it and be like, yeah, this is awesome. But then also to look at through the lens of an 8-year-old. Like, 8-year-old me would be pretty furious that I have no pets right now. Like, I'm pretty happy overall, and I don't like the responsibility of having pets right now, which is why I don't have them. But 8-year-old me would be like, you can't say 11, you don't have a dog.
That's so funny. Yeah, I was gonna say we have a guinea pig named Potato, so I would
That's
probably
awesome.
be excited about that. And we have a nice yard. I would be happy about that as an 8-year-old, and my family's cool. So hopefully 8-year-old me would be pretty excited.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for such a unique and interesting perspective, and for taking your time to share it with us today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that. You can find the show notes at boldmovespodcast.com. That will have all the links to find Jeff online, as well as the links to the books he recommends, because you might have a little more time to be reading these days, so you can check those out. There's also a big list called the Bold Moves book list, which is still a work in progress, but it is book recommendations from many of my past podcast guests. For some reason, I didn't think to make it right away, so it is coming later than it maybe should have, but there's still a lot there, and they're really fantastic, so I recommend it. There's also a page with podcast guests, again, work in progress, so it's not complete, but listed by category. So if you need to binge listen, you can do that there with the particular sort of motivation or inspiration or topics you're looking for. All right, I hope you are staying safe and healthy in this time. If there's anything I can do, reach out. I kind of went dark on social media for a little bit, but I think I'm back and ready to build community while we are all hopefully staying home or staying safe if you are a medical professional or someone who is in a profession that is deemed necessary to work outside the home. You are in my prayers. Let's all band together, and thank you so much for listening. Of course, share this with anyone who you think would enjoy it. Also, please subscribe, and if you have a minute, leave me a nice review on Apple Podcasts. All right, as always, be bold and have a sparkly day. Bye-bye.